Now we're going to take a look at the 21st President of the United States, Chester A. Arthur. Again, the five criteria: growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and most importantly, do they leave the country better or worse than they found it? Arthur takes over after Garfield's assassination, and I don't think a lot of people had a lot of optimism for Arthur. From what I was reading, it seemed like the assumption was that Arthur was going to be a typical corrupt politician, one of the party boss members. He had been someone who had been part of the party boss system for the longest time. He was going to do favors for his political allies, and he was exactly what they kind of voted for Garfield over him for, over those type of politicians, because Garfield was seen as a reformer, and Arthur was seen as more of the same. And I think Arthur surprised some people because a lot of the things that he did were more reform oriented than people thought they were going to be. Maybe this was because of Arthur's health. Arthur had a disease that he believed was fatal, and it was fatal. He died a year after he left office. How early he knew he was sick, how early he knew that this was going to be his legacy, I don't know. But it does seem to be a shock to a lot of people who were watching his presidency that he wasn't corrupt or as corrupt as they expected him to be, that he did pass a lot of reform acts. The Pendleton Act, which created civil service exams in a lot of ways, was huge. We looked at the Gilded Age, and we're talking the Gilded Age, and often I think Grant and Garfield and Arthur and other Gilded Age presidents often get painted with this, oh, it was a horrible, corrupt time brush. And one of the reasons I'm glad I'm doing this series and that this series reminds me of is, yes, this was a very corrupt time relative to our perspective, but relative to what came before, these were the reformers. These were the people who were saying, hey, the spoils system that Jackson put in place was horrible. Hey, the party boss system that Van Buren created, we need to get rid of that. This is all bad. These things were created, and these were the people who were reforming them. And we know about the corruption, and we know about the things. We have all the newspaper articles and reporting on it because they were being investigated, whereas before it was just accepted as a norm. This was reform in a lot of ways, not to excuse things, but just to kind of put it in perspective. So I think you have to give Arthur some credit for being a reformer. Maybe he wasn't the reformer Garfield would have been, and we'll talk about that as we get to the end when we do final ratings. But the Pendleton Act was huge, and I think that's something he should be given credit for. Um, in terms of growth, how that affected it, I think it was a big growth period of time, and I do think professionalization of the government in the United States and also in the rest of the world was a large part of why industrialization started to work. I think the idea of just putting people who knew what the hell they were doing in power rather than your uncle or your nephew or someone who was just related, but actually finding people who are competent and also educating your people, creating an educated workforce was just a huge change. And I think he doesn't get credit for that because he didn't come up with the idea, but that's what was going on in the world. So I also temper his growth numbers by saying the entire world was growing this time. He kind of came in at a time when growth was there. He had a surplus. We'll get to that in finances. But I also have to give him a knock for doing some things that I think slowed growth, particularly with regards to immigration. I think the Chinese Exclusion Act is nearly unforgivable. And yes, he attempted to he attempted to veto it the first time, and he got it to be less strong than it would have been. And yes, it was an incredibly popular thing at the time because America was, basically only people who were voting were white men who did not want Chinese people coming here and getting jobs, despite the fact that they built the railroads in a lot of ways and that they were clearly a net benefit to the country. They wanted theirs, and so I will give him slight. I'm not going to give him a huge knock on growth, but I can't give him a huge bonus either. In terms of finances, there was a budget surplus that he inherited. He and Garfield both inherited because the taxes were so high to pay for the Civil War and never really got reduced quickly enough. But at the same time, they weren't killing the economy. There was not a major recession during his watch. Things were going well. He did reduce taxes on pretty much everything but liquor as far as excise taxes. There were some reductions in tariffs, but not nearly as much as I think there probably should have been, and not as much as people called for at the time. So I think that's a knock against him in terms of finances. But I also think things went fairly well with regards to finances during time. So I'd give him a net moderate positive, nothing substantial. In terms of international politics, I was thinking about this a lot because I'm looking at the rest of the world. I'm looking at the Boer War with the British in South Africa, which I just did a video on for the apartheid video. I'm thinking about the French getting into the Sino-Japanese War. I'm thinking about the wars between Germany and France that are going on around this time. I'm thinking about the complexities of Europe and colonization, and how America was able to stay out of that mess. And as that mess blew up into World War I, we were able to be on the outside, still getting the benefits of industrialization, still gaining things and becoming a major industrialized power, which would propel us into the 20th century as the primary power in a lot of ways. We'll get into all the discussions when we get into World War I and World War II, but I think him staying out of that was also to his benefit. I also think, again, the Chinese Exclusion Act, I keep bringing it back up, but I think it's important. Our nativism, I think we had an opportunity we had an opportunity to continue our growth and not be as a nativist a state. And I think every time America has grown and been successful is when we had waves of immigrants coming in, and we're basically taking everyone's best and letting our country grow. I've done many videos on the Irish, the Chinese, the Polish, the Germans, the Italians, all of these waves of immigrants, and they came over and how they were treated poorly when they got here, but then ended up being absolutely critical to the growth and success of the United States. And I think him not understanding that, or at least the country not understanding that, and him not fully being able to convince them is something you have to hold against him slightly. But again, I still think in the context of the time, I'm not going to give him a major knock against. We kind of talked about this. Jackson is like, you can be mad at Andrew Jackson, but you have to understand the electorate. He did what the electorate said wanted to do. Arthur actually fought against it a little bit. So I have to give him, again, lukewarm. In terms of in terms of war and security, he identified that we needed a navy and that we needed to expand the navy, we needed to grow the navy, and he invested appropriately. And I think that was a major thing that showed to be a good decision. I'm going to give him credit on war and security. Again, we weren't involved in any of these international wars. We weren't doing the expansion. We were we were staying out of trouble, and I think that is sometimes underrated. I think boring presidencies sometimes get overlooked because people just assume that presidencies will be, that boring presidents were bad presidents, and I think the opposite sometimes. I think when nothing bad happens in a time when the world is going crazy, and countries all around the world are industrializing and getting into wars of resources, being able to stay out of those things, maybe because we had a country that had so many natural resources that we didn't have to get so deep and entrenched, but still staying out of it is something we need to identify and understand and create credit for. Um, some of his things on Native Americans weren't that great, but again, we have to do comparisons to what came before and what came after, and I think he was fine. I think a lot of things I'm saying about Chester Arthur really come around to he's fine. He wasn't exceptional. He wasn't poor, and maybe I'm also giving him extra credit because I'm thinking about the last time we had vice presidents come to power. Let's go through John Tyler, who was a horrible president. Millard Fillmore, who I don't think was a very good president in any way, shape, or form, and Andrew Johnson, who is one of the second is arguably the worst president. I have currently second behind Buchanan, but only because Buchanan was incredibly bad. That's what happened the last three times someone was assassinated. And Arthur, I think, did a decent job. I don't necessarily think that he did a better job than Garfield would have, but he did a decent job. Which brings us to the better or worse scale. Um, Arthur did not leave anything that I look back on going, wow, he was an amazing president. I think I have a little bit a tinge of sadness in realizing I think Arthur might be the last president we had that actively tried to even end Jim Crow in any real way. But I can't really knock him for the fact that he was unable to. The Supreme Court had ruled in Cruikshanks that the federal government couldn't enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1875 for all intents and purposes. So that's not on him. I think he tried to do some outreach in Virginia. Didn't work out. He still had black appointees. He made an effort. It just wasn't successful. I also think that the Chinese Exclusion Act and his not reducing tariffs sufficiently when there were good opportunities at that point for the U.S. to grow and really become an international power. Like, I think there's a missed opportunity throughout the Gilded Age when Europe is shooting itself in the foot. We do take a step forward, but I think we could have taken even more. So with that in mind, I think he falls into what I would say are not a president who left the country better than he found it. So that means he's not going to be in our top five, certainly. Um, but not a president who left the country significantly worse than he found it. I don't think. I think the line probably is. I think if Garfield had stayed, the presidency. I think Garfield would have been a better president if he stayed on. So obviously he's not going to be ahead of Garfield. I think I'm going to slide him in at ninth, just past James Madison. And here's my logic. I think James Madison, in the end, left the country better than he found it, which is shocking considering again, the Capitol burned to the ground in his first term. But I think James Madison's second term was amazing. And I think he left a country that was in really good shape because he learned the lessons that he learned from the mistakes of the first term in terms of overextension, in terms of engaging in a war with Europe, in terms of not really. He set the foundation that would become the Monroe document, I guess you would say, but understanding like we needed to take care of our situation. We don't need to be getting involved in these international things, and so I think he left the country better than he found it. I don't think Chester A. Arthur left the country better than he found it. I don't know that he left it worse than he found it. I think he left it okay. I think he did a replacement level job at his job. And I think the two Adams who would come after him left the country worse than they found it. So that means he falls in at ninth, which I think is appropriate. That's we have done 21 presidents, and nine is basically middle of the road. So Chester A. Arthur, he's going to be number 9, 21st president of the United States.